Hi everyone. So I wanted to help you a little bit in working with a few sources for your final project. Now, I want to remind you though that this is not a research heavy project at all. This is simply a way for you to make sure you know how to incorporate some extra information into your writing. Most of your writing for this piece will be reliant on your own personal examples and experiences. You can even harness some of those skills that you use for writing your narrative at the beginning of the semester and utilize them in little chunks here with your final writing project. But I do want you to consider your rhetorical appeals when you're writing this piece. And to do that, to build some of your credibility, to build in some logic, you may want to incorporate a little bit of information that you find elsewhere. So I want to help you in doing that today. I also want to remind you, and I'll reiterate this again, that this project is about encouraging your audience to try something that you personally love and enjoy. All right. So what could you use for this project? Let's say that you are wanting to talk about how cooking from home saves you money and it's a wonderful thing to do. You want to encourage your college classmates to start cooking. This would be a great topic, right? Because maybe college students are just now starting to branch out on their own. Maybe they have their own apartment this year and they need to start cooking to save themselves some money. So what could you use? Well, maybe you could do an interview, maybe with someone who enjoys cooking. Maybe there's a news article out there about how cooking from home saves you money. Perhaps there's a web page that teaches someone how to start cooking. Maybe there's a statistic out there about, again, cooking from home saving money or photograph. Occasionally, you might would use a scholarly article for this particular assignment, but definitely don't think that you have to. Now, I do want to make sure you utilize the tips I gave you last week, I believe, about evaluating your sources. You don't want to, for example, give a phony statistic. You want to use very relevant and credible sources here, but don't feel like you've got to tap into some kind of complicated scholarly article for this particular assignment. All right, now anything that's common knowledge, you're fine. You don't have to cite it. It's not necessarily that you need to find a source for it to prove anything. So an example of common knowledge is something that is typically very, very well known, especially by your reader, your audience. So for example, Facebook is a social media platform. I don't need to cite this. I don't need to try to find some source that says this and give a bunch of citations here. That's common knowledge. We don't need to cite anything for that. But if it's anything you saw or read or heard from somewhere else and you're using that information that didn't come from your brain, then you're going to want to make sure that you treat it as a source and you give credit where it's due. So if you read a news article and there's information from that, if you listen to a podcast, if you watch a lecture at MTSU, these are all examples of sources that if you use the information from them, you would have to give credit where they are due. And this is whether you write the information word for word, which is what we call quoting. So typically, a good rule of thumb is if you've got about 3 or 4 words in a row that are exactly how the original author said it, you're going to want to put it in quote marks, right? You want to make sure that you are giving credit not only for their ideas, but how they said their ideas. If you're putting in your own words, this is called paraphrasing. Or if you're taking a large quantity of information and condensing it and putting in your own words, that's called summarizing. So no matter if you quote, paraphrase, or summarize, if the information, the ideas come from somewhere else, you do need to make sure that you are citing your sources. You've got to provide attribution. So this would be something like according to Smith, or as Smith says. Or maybe you've even seen it in parentheses. So you incorporate the information as a sentence, and then at the end of the sentence, you put parentheses, Smith, comma, 2020, and then you end your parentheses. That would be an example of the information coming from Smith, the author, and it was written in the year 2020. In APA, we provide dates. All right, so if you're incorporating a paraphrase, make sure you're saying it in your own way. And this is when you're not using it word for word, right? Do you still have to cite? Hopefully you've gotten it by now, but yes. So again, just to reiterate, Whether you are quoting or paraphrasing, you do have to cite your source and give credit. Now, I have an easy way to do this. This is called the Oreo cookie method. So if you use this method anytime you're incorporating information, it will leave you sounding really smooth and cool and smart. So basically, the idea is to structure any kind of information you're incorporating into your writing. So the top cookie is your lead-in. This is going to be where you give context and provide a signal phrase like according to Smith, as Smith argues. Then you're going to incorporate the creamy filling. This is the good stuff. This is the information that comes from your source, whether you put it in your own words, paraphrasing, or whether you use it word for word quoting. Now, I will say you want to use quotes very, very, very sparingly. Only on the occasion when something's said so perfectly and so accurate and precise and it's just amazing do you quote. A lot of times, though, in academic writing especially, you will learn how to paraphrase. All right, once you've incorporated the information, don't just leave us hanging. You have to tell your reader why the information matters. So follow up in some kind of way. Explain the information. Maybe if you're going against what was said, you want to debunk it, or maybe you want to interpret it or add to it. So just make sure you have that final bottom cookie. Now here's an example in action so that this makes sense to you. This is a much more academic example, but I think it will work for you here. So here's your blue is your top cookie. It's your context and your lead-in. So it says, one of the most obvious discrepancies between women and men's work during the COVID-19 pandemic can be seen through recent trends in academic publishing. There's my context. Here's my lead-in. For example, Kitchener 2020 presents. So Kitchener is my author. In this case, I'm using APA, so I would have my date in parentheses, and then my signal word here, presents. All right, so here comes my creamy filling. That's the red part. So Kitchener presents, and this is a paraphrase, right? You don't see any quote marks here. That's because I put the information in my own word. Presents a vastly different picture of male and female academic work from home perspectives, where male faculty members describe quarantine as helpful because it allows even more time for writing. All right, now I'm not going to just leave my reader hanging. I've got to follow up, and this is what you see in green, my bottom cookie. The issue is particularly alarming considering that publishing is imperative to tenure and promotion. All right, so that way all the information is incorporated really smoothly into my own words. Okay, so again, remember for this particular project, you are trying to explain why it's awesome, whatever it is, why something you love is wonderful, and why we, your audience, your reader, should try it. So some people were skipping the assignment sheet here and they were just diving straight into some kind of argumentative topic. Some of them would be great for next semester, but for English 1010, we are sticking to this particular structure here. Remember, this is also not research heavy. It relies a lot on personal experiences and examples. So make sure you go back to one of those first slides and see the type of examples, the type of research that we're looking at here. It could even be something as simple as an interview. And then don't forget about your best friend, Owl Purdue, which is going to give you some guidance if you need to cite the information. So let's actually just really quickly go over to Owl. And just a reminder, they can give you some information about how to cite in text. And again, you can do that through a lot of times your attribution phrase. So here, let's say you did an interview. You may something like, according to Mary Smith, who is the who cooks from home all the time. Or maybe you're interviewing the restaurant owner, right? According to Mary Smith, owner of this particular restaurant, and then you could give the information like that. So again, this is just sort of practicing these ideas of using something like a signal phrase for you here. Now, let's say you do get a statistic, let's say, and here's some information on numbers and statistics as well. That usually this has to do with how you list numbers and that sort of thing. But let's say that you are, let's say, here's an article on Forbes, right, that talks about how much money I'm going to save from cooking at home. If I want to cite that, I'm going to say, I'm going to have my in-text citation. And then I'm also going to need then a references page at the end. So I would go to electronic sources. I would find, see, this is why genre matters. You have to know what kind of source you're working with. And I would go to online news article. So at the end of my paper, I would have a references page, and I would include the author's last name. I would include the date when it's published, the article title, where it's published, so Forbes, and the URL. And then they're really awesome here. So they're giving me an example. This particular article was written by Richards C. In APA, we don't use the author's first name. They've provided the date. We follow all these little tiny things like where to put a period, where to put a parentheses. Titles in APA, for example, are not capitalized. You see here how it's just the first word, anything after a colon, as well as proper nouns would be capitalized too. But everything else, strangely, is lowercase. The publication's italicized, and then there's the URL. All right, I don't expect you to be perfect here. I'll give you some feedback on those kinds of things, but hopefully that'll kind of help you as you get going. So if you have any questions about your type of source, please reach out to me. Again, I want to point out, and I think I've done this earlier, but in all the things that you see here on OWL Purdue, they always give you a sample paper. So if you're not sure how something should look, and again, this is a very, this paper here is a very long research paper, so it's definitely not going to look like what we are doing. But I always like to, just to make sure I'm doing everything correctly, I utilize things like the references page, just to make sure everything's set up properly. And of course, they have for MLA style as well. All right. Good luck on this project. Just don't forget the parameters of the project as far as what your goal of the project is, and that it should not be research heavy.